rights to black men who met specific criteria insofar as their minimal annual income and educational level. And despite its inherent flaws, the Cape Colony's qualified franchise represented an anomaly in South African race relations to the extent that any form of black political participation was firmly prohibited in neighboring South African colonial territories. Now, to an elite and educated group of black South Africans emerging out of the Cape Methodist missionary schools, Cape liberalism functioned as an imperfect but useful starting point for greater liberalization of the political system. Yet still, I argue, it remained an elusive and deceptive mechanism for preserving white political dominance through its non-exclusive criterion. Now, the qualified franchise system inadvertently fostered the emergence of an educated black elite at the turn of the 20th century, whose interests and aspirations shaped the programs. All of these theorists sought to advance a theory of territorial segregation as a solution to South Africa's native problem. Moreover, they sought to establish a comprehensive policy which, by humanizing the nature of white domination and facilitating African advancement, would avert any serious challenge to white supremacy. These thinkers did not only form part of South Africa's liberal tradition, but also held key positions of social and political influence, including the formation of liberal organizations like South Africa's Institute of Race Relations during the interwar years. On the whole, and after the formation of Union in 1910, segregationist ideology can be understood as being insidiously linked to liberal ideas. The idealized liberal values of common citizenship associated with the 19th century Cape now seemed a distant antecedent, while some of these views were recanted and revised by people like Brooks and others from 1927 onwards due to the pressure of African members of the Joint Council movements. The foundation had already been laid. Liberal thought and its entanglement to racist and segregationist discourse was laid to bear. And the term liberal, and I want to emphasize this, the term liberal would not easily shed its pejorative label from the perspective of black intellectuals. Liberalism's weaknesses were clear to many black intellectuals concerned with its proximity to white supremacy and its lack of potential for radical, social, and egalitarian change. Now, the emergence of a black liberalism in South Africa also bears a distinct imprint of liberalism's colonial genesis. It develops primarily amongst a Christianized elite against the backdrop of a wave of post-colonial independence of other African states, rendering it largely defensive in character. Before the formation of Union, its adherents looked hopefully towards the British Imperial Centre for Protection, whereas after 1910, its chief exponents struggled to defend the Cape franchise and resist encroaching segregationist policies. The African National Congress, in its pre-war incarnation, embodied this political disposition, being predominantly, though not exclusively, Christian, liberal, and constitutionalist in orientation, and I quote from Walsh. Black liberals maintained tenuous hopes of accessing the state through sympathetic English-speaking power brokers, until the National Party's electoral victory in 1948 delivered a decisive blow to their aspirations. This political setback accelerated the appeal of more radical alternatives, including Pan-Africanism and communism within black oppositional circles. Now, where am I going with all of this? Because this was a kind of what I believe to be an interesting, and again, this is part of an academic paper that I'm very close to completing, and part of a broader book project. But where am I going with this with regards to the figure of Z.K. Matthews and the Freedom Charter? So out of the story emerges many fascinating strands of political thinking, which require a closer interrogation of ideas in context. Here, one central figure is Z.K. Matthews, a black professor and African National Congress leader. Matthews occupies a singular position in South African history. He was the first black South African to earn a bachelor's degree from a South African university, the first black South African to become a university professor, and the first to serve as a principal of a black university, Fort Hare. Beyond these pioneering academic achievements, Matthews was also a key political figure in the ANC, where he helped shape the organization's constitutional vision. Through a close examination of his writings and political activities, which I've been immersed in the last year, I hope to illuminate the distinctive and somewhat peculiar strain of his liberal orientation, which I think is very important because of the way in which it impacts the development of a freedom charter. I venture to introduce a new conceptual category to more clearly delineate the contours of his thought, something I term anti-colonial liberalism, which Matthews develops during the formative decades of apartheid. His sophisticated engagement with liberal thought offers us insight into the various creative attempts of black political imagination to respond to the pernicious nature of the institutionalization of apartheid. Now, Z.K. Matthews' distinctive strain of anti-colonial liberalism emerges from a very specific intellectual context, shaped by his formative missionary education at Lovedale, the stark contradictions of South Africa's race relations, his sojourns at the University of London and Yale, and other global and national political events. Matthews is variously described in historical accounts, and this is very interesting for me as I read into some very, very early kind of archival documents where he is described as a liberal paternalist or a cautious ANC liberal without qualification. But this Procrustean characterization, I suggest, is not attentive to the complexity of his political thought. In Matthews' case, the unqualified liberal designation obscures how he critically engaged with, transformed, and sometimes rejected aspects of liberal thought in response to colonial realities. Now, through this kind of archival investigation, I've been, uncovering all kinds of interesting things. And one thing that I recently stumbled upon was some of the 1970 prison letters of Nelson Mandela. And in these letters, or contained in these letters, Mandela, for example, wrote on the occasion of Z.K. Matthews' death, and I quote, "The question of whether Z.K. was a liberal, conservative, or an agitator becomes a purely terminological one, which we must leave to academics. We remember him with much affection." I wish I could have displayed this on the slides because I have the handwritten letters. But this was from Mandela's prison letters, 1st October 1970. So I guess I find this to be an interesting little snippet because my task in this sense is really to interrogate Mandela's plea to kind of get into this notion of Matthews' legacy. Now, this term anti-colonial liberal, I think, better captures how Matthews selectively drew upon liberal principles while simultaneously critiquing liberal complicity with colonial rule. In a doctrinaire sense, and for those of you who are philosophers and political theorists in the room, liberalism in its theoretical formulation encompasses what Ayesha Berlin famously distinguished as the two concepts of liberty: negative liberty, which is freedom from, and positive liberty, which is freedom to. For Berlin, negative liberty refers to the absence of constraints, interference, or obstacles, the domain in which an individual can act unobstructed by others. Positive liberty, by contrast, concerns the possession of the resources, capacities, and opportunities necessary for self-mastery and self-realization. Now, unlike many of his white liberal contemporaries who often emphasized negative liberty while remaining silent on the structural conditions that prevented black South Africans from exercising meaningful freedom, Matthews, in my sort of interrogation of his writings, political writings and ideas, I suggest, insisted on the interdependence of both forms. His conception of liberty was neither wholly derivative of Western liberal tradition, nor entirely detached from them. Rather, it represented a critical engagement that both embraced core liberal principles, but also interrogated their applications in the colonial setting. In the realm of negative liberty, Matthews, for example, consistently advocated for full citizenship rights and civil liberties for black South Africans. His critique of Western individualism in his 1933 Yale master's thesis, Matthews expressed skepticism with excessive liberal individualism, noting, and I quote, that the Bantu, in an attempt to adjust themselves to modern society with its aggressive individualism, have to or are called upon to give up conceptions of the fitness of things which they hold dear in the old days. Attempted this complex task of reconciling African customary law with Roman Dutch jurisprudence, reflecting his commitment to finding constitutional arrangements that would protect individual rights while honoring indigenous legal traditions. In another paper, the 1951 Foreign Affairs article, entitled The African Response to Racial Laws, Matthews articulated a vision of equality for all races that drew upon Western constitutional traditions while rejecting their selective application under colonial rule. On the fundamental right to self-determination, he argued, like all other people, the African people claim the right of self-determination. The Africans' desire for equality is represented in some quarters as an artificial product of agitators, or, as they've been recently described, learned natives discussing high politics. Every responsible African believes that the political education of his people is a necessary task. That's from 1951 on page 102. Matthews explicitly addressed how the South African government utilized accusations of communism to discredit legitimate African political demands. And here he says, perhaps the most dangerous onslaught upon the liberties of the people of South Africa is the passing of the amended Suppression of Communism Act. This act purports to strike at the Communist Party of South Africa, now dissolved, and at communism. South Africa is not alone in regarding communism as one of the greatest evils of modern times. Few amongst the African people are in favor of communism, and the Communist Party of South Africa made no significant headway amongst the African people or in African organizations. Matthews further clarifies the independence of his ideas from communist influence, directly addressing the government's false equivalence between African political demands and communist sympathy. Matthews plays a pivotal role in drafting the African Claims document of 1943, which responds to Churchill and Roosevelt Atlantic Charter by speaking of the just claims of non-European people to freedom, democracy, and human decency. This capacious document serves then as a blueprint for a Bill of Rights, which the ANC later adopts. It explicitly claims for Africans the same liberties: freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, and freedom of association that were considered foundational in Western liberal democracies, but systematically denied to black South Africans. The main tenure of the document as it starts: we, the African people in the Union of South Africa, urgently demand the granting of full citizenship rights, such as are enjoyed by all Europeans in South Africa. Later, in his powerful 1955 address to the ANC Cape Provincial Conference, he speaks firmly about a free South Africa for a free people who enjoy equal rights, whatever their color, race, or creed. He notes his opposition to the narrow nationalism which would seek to create a caste society in South Africa with an apex of a minority of so-called national-minded whites with various grades of underlings ranging from so-called unnational-minded whites through coloreds, Indians, and down to Africans below them. He further proposes a mass democratic organization of the Congress of the People. And I quote, "The mighty Congress of the People is a vast concourse of people drawn from every racial group and from every part of the country, to gather and will speak freely to South Africa and to the world about the kind of South Africa they would like to see established in this country." The Congress of the People, he argues, should adopt a freedom charter, a proposal subsequently embraced by the ANC National Conference. Perhaps most significantly, Matthew's vision for South Africa's future was embodied in his proposal for the Freedom Charter, which he described in 1955 as a document that will sound a dream to the reactionary elements which have been in the ascendancy for too long in this country, but the vision which the Congress of the People will set before the people of South Africa will, with the passage of time, become clearer and clearer, and will set before all goals for which to strive in the years that lie ahead. This vision represented neither a wholesale rejection of liberal principles nor their uncritical adoption. Instead, it constituted a kind of creative reinterpretation of liberalism's promise in the context of racial domination. The resulting charter provided a comprehensive program for fundamental social, political, and economic change, effectively serving as an alternative South African constitution which envisioned a future non-racial society. The Freedom Charter that emerged from Matthew's initial proposal provided a comprehensive document or program that was destined to serve as a foundation for a future constitution of a non-racial and unified South Africa, endorsed by all groups. Now, just as significant was Matthew's emphasis on positive liberty. He demonstrated a lifelong commitment to furthering African education, not merely as a means of escaping material poverty, but as an essential foundation for meaningful political participation. In a repudiation of the liberal C.T. Lorem, whose influential arrested development thesis suggested that Africans required a specialized limited curriculum suited to their supposedly different capabilities, Matthews insisted on equal educational opportunities while maintaining cultural integrity. Education, Matthews argues, must be rooted in the modern world with a sensitivity to indigenous culture and tradition. And I close quote. This vision manifested in the development of the African Studies curriculum at Fort Hare, which served as the first black South African, where he served as the first black South African to head a university department. His educational philosophy rejected the uncritical westernization and cultural isolationism, instead seeking a synthesis that would equip Africans to engage on equal terms in the modern world while maintaining connection to their cultural heritage. Education for Matthews was not merely about individual advancement, but about collective emancipation, the creation of an African public sphere capable of asserting itself in colonial political discourse. Now, Matthews' participation in various political fora, including the Native Representative Councils and the Joint Councils, further demonstrated his commitment to creating spaces for the exercise of positive liberty. In these forums, he vigorously opposed the Hertzog bills and marshaled critiques of the colonial structure. His essay, The Black Man's Outlook of 1953, which is often completely disregarded in the literature, exposed the disingenuous nature of white liberals who advocated formal equality while benefiting from structural inequality. This critical stance towards his liberal contemporaries reveals Matthews' recognition that negative liberty alone, without addressing the material conditions of oppression, were insufficient for meaningful freedom. What distinguishes Matthews' liberalism most clearly from its European antecedents was its unflinching critique of colonial oppression and dispossession. Unlike many white South African liberals of his era who often hesitated to directly challenge the state, Matthews did not shy away from oppositional politics. His political thought was further marked by a tenor of Christian liberalism, influenced by his missionary education in Lovedale, where the notion of equality as a central Christian ideal had been impressed upon him. This religious dimension provided a kind of moral authority to his political claims, while distinguishing his approach from more secular variants of liberal philosophy. In his 1951 Foreign Affairs article, Matthews articulated this vision of a cooperative yet equal society. The ANC, he argues, stands for one South African nation in which all peoples shall enjoy equal rights of citizenship. This position stood in stark contrast to apartheid racial hierarchies and reflected his conviction that liberal principles could be applied universally. Matthew's anti-colonial liberalism is perhaps most evident in the 1943 African Claims in South Africa document, which he helped draft. It begins with this unequivocal demand that we, the African people in the Union of South Africa, urgently demand the granting of full citizenship right, but also outlines specific demands related to both negative and positive liberties. Matthew's deeply considered critique of Bantu education revealed the depth of his commitment to education as a vehicle of liberation. Now, I'm just wondering how I'm doing for time, because I have a very long address and I want to... Do I have 10 minutes? Okay, great. It's also good to know that that I'm being listened to on the other side, because right now it's completely sort of mute on my side. Anyway, so I want to talk a little bit about Matthew's kind of argument for property rights in 1954 at the ANC conference address at Uitenhage, which illustrates his liberal principles as they apply to economic liberty. He argued, there is no place where the African can say to himself, this is my own land, my native land, here I intend to remain. Here I will invest all my hard-earned savings, knowing that I will not overnight be faced with the total loss of my earnings because someone would like to displace me. I say there is no place where the African can lay his head in safety from arbitrary interference. Now, for me, this passage reveals how Matthews coupled the language of classical liberalism, property rights, economic security, and freedom from arbitrary interference, with a powerful critique of colonial dispossession. The liberal ideas of property and security became, in his hands, tools for exposing the fundamental contradictions of liberal conceptions of apartheid reform. By insisting on both negative freedoms, that is, civil liberties, political rights, non-racial citizenship, and positive conditions of freedom, such as education, economic opportunity, cultural integrity, and black advancement, Matthews articulated a vision of liberalism that exposed the contradictions of its colonial application, while reaffirming for him a core emancipatory potential of liberal political thought. His position on cooperation was one of cooperation with all on terms of equality only. And again, I'm quoting from him. A formulation that, as he noted in 1951, refutes those who accuse the African people of being bent upon establishing a nation consisting exclusively of Africans, with Africans dominating minority groups. And perhaps this is where he falls out of favor with other formations. Matthews' embrace of liberal principles, however, provoked significant tensions within the broader African liberation movement. His vision of a non-racial South Africa, embodied in the Freedom Charter of 1955, came under fierce criticism from Africanist factions within and beyond the ANC. Most prominently, and there are those in the room who are far more equipped to speak about this, Robert Sobukwe and his followers regarded the Charter's liberal universalism with deep suspicion. For Sobukwe, who would later found the PAC in 1959, the Charter's declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, represented a kind of betrayal of African nationalism and indigenous claims to the land. The Africanist critique highlighted enduring tensions in anti-colonial thought between universal liberal principles and particular indigenous claims. And I think this is a very important normative point that I'm trying to tease out in my paper. Whereas Matthews sought to appropriate and transform liberal principles for African liberation, Sobukwe and his followers contended such an approach would inevitably subordinate African interests to European paradigms. For them, Matthews' liberal inflections, his emphasis on non-racialism, constitutional rights, and civic rather than ethnic nationhood, diluted the more fundamental project of reclaiming African independence. Now, this kind of ideological rift ultimately led to the formation of the PAC as a separate political entity, committed to a more kind of exclusive African nationalism that eschewed Matthews and others within his kind of orientations, form of liberal universalism. Yet, despite these challenges from more radical quarters, Matthews remained committed to, and again, if I had more time, I would go into a lot more sort of a substantive detail on this, a distinctive form of anti-colonial liberalism. While recognizing the limitations of liberal thought as traditionally formulated in Europe, he insisted that its emancipatory potential could be realized in the African context, if critically reinterpreted through the lens of the experience of those who are colonized. And he speaks a lot about this in various writings, but in particular in some of his writings on educational advancement and other kinds of important interventions that he makes at the joint councils. In fact, one of the things that I did want to get into a little bit detail on, but I didn't have time, is on this kind of evaluative dimension of liberalism, which he was very much concerned with. What I found in the archives was a really interesting document that he authored in 1947, where he directly states that he laments the tragic weakness of South African liberalism and the impotence of white liberals and their Congress. I mean, he displays a huge amount of disappointment with this tradition and the way in which it operates. Yet he still continues to be sort of termed and understood as one as a kind of liberal paternalist, which I think is really something that needs to be properly disentangled. And I'm hoping by introducing this category of a kind of anti-colonial liberalism, there is a greater kind of nuance that is added to understanding his ideas, and a way in which we don't just sort of kind of collapse all these categories into these very muddy ideological and conceptual terms. So as a way of kind of conclusion then, I think intellectual history offers a really valuable methodological approach for examining South Africa's rich but often neglected traditions of Black thought, and in particular on important institutions and documents like that of the Freedom Charter. This history holds particular relevance today as South Africans continue to grapple with the promises and limitations of its liberal democratic order. The persistent tension between liberal ideas and the imperatives of racial and economic justice that concerned Matthews remains central to contemporary debates about transformation and equality. His intellectual legacy offers valuable insights into how we might reimagine South Africa's response to contemporary challenges without resorting to ahistorical or romanticized accounts of anti-colonial thought. Now, intellectual history provides a necessary corrective to two problematic tendencies in contemporary South African discourse. And this, I think, is really, really important, because I'm pretty sure in the questions there will be questions along those kinds of lines, which is about contested histories. The first is the reduction of complex historical figures to abstract symbols of moral heroism, and the instrumentalization of liberation history for narrow political purposes. And this is the kind of problem that we see with abundance of hagiographies that are coming out. But by recovering this contextual richness of Black intellectual traditions, their internal debates, conceptual innovations, and historical contingencies, we gain resources for thinking more creatively and critically about present conditions. The case of Matthews and the Freedom Charter illustrates how intellectual history can recover the reconstructive, not merely oppositional dimensions of anti-colonial thought. Far from simply refuting colonial ideology, Matthews and some of his colleagues were engaged in this ambitious project of reimagining political community, kind of putting forth the thrusts of a new political vision and articulating alternative visions of social organizations. Now, we can retrospectively argue about whether their ways, their motivations, and how they went about thinking about these things were right or wrong. But as South Africa confronts ongoing crises of inequality, poverty, democratic legitimacy, and also on historical memory, this tradition of imaginative political thinking, I think, very importantly offers the kind of indispensable resources for confronting the unfinished business of transformation. And I think this is something that we can take from this, the legacy of Z.K. Matthews and what I term his anti-colonial liberalism. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aisha. I know that, with the conversations that you are having today, they just remind me of yesterday's conversation that we were having.
I can't hear anything.
I'm
So I'm
sorry
not
to hear
sure what
that.
I'm meant to
I'm
hear
not.
at this point.
I'm sorry about that.
I,
But
I still can't hear.
okay.
Right.
All right.
Thank
Uh,
you.
no problem. Um, the conversations that we are having right now, they just reminded me of yesterday's conversation, about Unongawuse and how, these, interesting stories and, very instrumental stories about, the ways in which our people, were, backed into a corner, and the ways in which, we should think about the questions of, military intelligence, yeah, or also military studies, and security studies especially. And now, without, wasting any time, I know that we can, be here for a very long time as philosophers, because we like to speak quite a lot of time, but without further ado, I would like to bring forth again Umgabateli to give a response, and then after that we'll go for Q&A, and then we can go for lunch. Thank you.
Thanks. So my response is going to be quick. I hope that it will also allow for a rich Q&A. So the title of my response is, can liberalism ever be anti-colonial? Like that. In my understanding, particularly following Frantz Fanon, anti-colonialism is the movement of the masses, and insofar as the masses are excluded, in the liberal world, of understanding of individualized liberties, my claim is that liberalism can never be, anti-colonial, and of course I aim to elucidate this point through, an examination of the history of liberalism, in South Africa, as well as, how the ANC itself, was never a mass movement, and why it qualifies to be, a liberal movement. So basically, this is just to make the point that, I am quite unsure whether liberalism can ever be anti-colonial. So, if we study liberal thought in South Africa, we encounter a philosopher from Wits, R.F.A. Honle, whose native, the South African native policy and the liberal spirit was a progenitor of, formalized apartheid. So while we think that apartheid is a product of neoconservatism, however, according to John Soske and Dumiso Dladla, its motivation stems from that work, of R.F.A. Honle, who is the leading, liberal theorist from the university that Aisha comes from. And of course, how that influenced, apartheid, policy, that whole notion of, separate development, has went through several interpretations throughout time, in such that, liberalism managed to self-mutate and present itself as this, progressive, thought, whereas on the other hand, you would have separate development as a product of, Neo-Afrikaner dom. However, according to the elucidations by John Soske and Dumiso Dladla, apartheid is a product of liberal thought. So I just thought perhaps, we can, deal with that as we continue with our exposition of why the ANC has never really been a mass movement, and why it is indeed a liberal movement, as Aisha has characterized. So of course, one of the ANC's primary objectives, since its formation was, an attempt to recuperate the Cape qualified franchise model. And I'm here relying on Tom Lodge, who's Black politics in South Africa since 1945, he claims, of course, that, like the electoral activity in the Cape, required that, blacks needed to have property, needed to have educational qualifications for them to, stand and vote. And of course, the founding fathers, so-called founding fathers of the ANC, like were these men who, had these hopes, of being included. But of course, after the Anglo-Boer War, after the Vereeniging Treaty, the Boers, closed, shop with regards to this whole, philanthropic nature of the Cape liberalism. And of course, like a more, a stern approach that, these natives need to be excluded. And of course, that qualified franchise failed. So of course, this is why the ANC had to be formed, because the people that formed the ANC are what we can call amazimtid, like the people, exempted from the functioning of native law. And, I'm just going to quote like a section from, Lodge here. So he says, on 8th January 1912, there assembled in Bloemfontein several hundred of South Africa's most prominent African citizens, professional men, chieftains, ministers, teachers, clerks, interpreters, landlords, businessmen, journalists, estate agents, building contractors, and labor agents. These men, after singing Tio Soka's Xhosa hymn, "Fulfill Thy Promise, God of Truth," unanimously resolved to form the South African Native National Congress. So I'm making this point to say that since its inception, the ANC was never, concerned with mass participation in the struggle. Of course, throughout time with the reforms, by Dr. A.P. Kuma, and the advent of the ANC Youth League, we begin to see an ANC that, attempts to assume a mass character, which, was resisted, of course, hence, like the thriving liberalism, of the ZKs, which culminated into the Freedom Charter, took prominent, stage. So basically, mine is to say that insofar as the ANC was never a mass movement, insofar that it was, a movement of these Mazimtiti, it can never be, anti-colonial, especially if we characterize, anti-colonialism in the revolutionary thought of, Frantz Fanon. So yeah, perhaps, like I will just pause it here. And, like this was just to spark a conversation. Thank you very much, Aisha, for your thought-provoking presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Mkabateli. When we started this session, I wanted to play Uhuru by Other Soil, because in that song, they reflect there that, bahlupheka kanjani abantu ezandleni zabantu abamnyama, So this thing of suffrage of the black people at the hands of, our fellow black people, is in some way, what we are today speaking on. But given the issues that Aisha is receiving from her side, she won't be able to respond with questions because she can't hear us from our side. But perhaps since Ndate Dladla is here, we can pose some few questions and then we can quickly go for lunch. Okay. Then we'll see perhaps from the comments or if she comes back and then she can then respond. So we have 5 minutes.
Sorry, Tabang, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually heard. I actually heard that the very important Tabang's very important respondent comments, and I do want to respond to that before you take questions.
All right, no problem. That would be fine. That would be fine. So
Okay.
you can go ahead and then do a response, and then we can have Q&A.
Okay, so one of the issues that I do have is that the sound is not very clear, but I mean, I was able to make some notes. At least in broad outlines, I understood what he was saying, and I think that his intervention is really important. Not only important conceptually and philosophically, as a kind of response to some of the claims that I'm making, but also I think in terms of what I want to clarify, because I think I don't want us to get caught in conceptual debates about whether it's anti-colonial or not, because am I using anti-colonial in the Fanonian revolutionary sense, or am I using it more broadly in relation to, for example, some more contemporary definitions of anti-colonial thought in the work of people like Getachew and Parasha? So I'm not going to get into that debate, but I do think that the thrust of what Tabang said is actually critical. It's really, really important, and I want to identify some key dimensions. The first thing that I think is the tension that he's drawing is how can a liberalism ever be anti-colonial? And I think this is one of the difficulties of the kind of project that I'm doing, where I am, for example, immersing myself in archives that simultaneously revealed to me a kind of really fascinating kind of radical dimension. And I use the word radical reservedly because I'm very much I have an awareness of context. So they are radical for the moment in which they are responding to particular interventions or debates, and then at the same time there's a kind of immersion or a sense in which there is, like, it's imbued by a kind of a liberal fervor. And this is one of the specific historical issues that I have as I'm attempting to do this kind of work. And this is why I thought, is it useful to establish another kind of category? I mean, some people might even argue, is it, when I talk about anti-colonial, if I'm not talking about the Fanonian sense, even the term colonial itself is something that is contested in the context of South Africa. What do I mean by that? And then can I use the term, for example, that we had a colonialism of a special type? And that's what I mean by anti-colonial, a response to that colonialism of a special type. So that's a separate historical debate. But I think what's very important for me at this point is to make an argument for this tension, which is at liberalism's core. And I was trying to actually sort of tease it out, myself being an avowed critic in all my writings of liberal ideas. I mean, the fact that I came to this project is really to kind of understand the contemporary through a genealogical analysis. That if we claim that the ANC is not revolutionary or a mass democratic movement and produced a particular kind of outcome for the contemporary, surely those genealogical origins are evident in the way in which it attempted to articulate its early political vision around liberal principles. And this is absolutely something I think many people in the room would agree with if we read the writings of some of the early lawyers who were involved with the ANC, and some of the things that led to, for example, the formation of the charterist tradition. But what I want to talk about is that I want to make a distinction between a normative conception of liberal thought and some of the more evaluative and descriptive dimensions of liberal thought. And I think this distinction is really very, very important when we talk about an anti-colonial liberalism. We cannot talk about that if we're talking about it only descriptively and evaluatively. And why do I say this? I say this because there's huge kinds of challenges associated with claiming, for example, that a thinker like ZK is an anti-colonial liberal and foisting on him the term anti-colonial when, for example, there's an embrace of liberal values. So an attempt to reconstruct his intellectual position for me was about these kind of archival limitations, right? So what you have is, for example, you have, as I've mentioned in the early parts of my talk, in which Tabang just emphasized now, an emphasis in the more kind of popular discourse of liberalism's entanglement with segregationist ideology. And this is essential. We had liberal theorists who helped design the very architecture of racism and of institutionalized segregation, right? So the fundamental challenge then, if liberalism could be normatively committed to equality while simultaneously producing segregationist outcomes, how do we evaluate figures like Matthews who maintained liberal commitments? Were they working within a framework that was inherently compromised, or were they revealing liberalism's authentic potential against its colonial distortions? Now, given these complexities, the distinction between normative and evaluative liberal thought becomes crucial, I think, because what we see and what I'm trying to argue, and I didn't actually have enough time to get into, the nuances of the kind of political theory dimensions and the philosophical dimensions, was that Matthews clearly embraced core liberal principles as prescriptive ideals. For example, and it's not like, for the political theorists and philosophers in the room, that, you find in his account that he attempted to, for example, in the way in which my favorite black thinker of the canon, Sam Noluchungu, does, which is mount a devastating critique against liberalism by reading liberal ideas from C.B. Macpherson to John Locke. No, we don't find this present in Matthew's work. What we do find is a kind of core commitment to prescriptive liberal ideals like individual rights, equality before the law, a kind of democratic participation, constitutional governance, etc. And so his role in drafting the Freedom Charter demonstrates again this commitment to these kind of normative principles as the foundation for a just society. However, we must ignore that segregationist liberals also claimed normative commitment to the same principles. So there's this obscurity which exists, especially in the context of South Africa, which Thabang very rightly points out, makes the possibility of an anti-colonial liberalism almost impossible. Yet that said, I want to talk about this kind of notion of an evaluative liberal thought. What distinguished Matthews was his deployment of liberalism as an analytical tool. Using liberal principles not as ends in themselves, but as instruments for exposing the kind of contradictions of colonial rule. So when he argues that Africans deserve full citizenship rights, etc., he was using liberal equality as an evaluative standard to expose the illegitimacy of colonial exclusion. And in that way, he does, I suggest, put forth a kind of anti-colonial, and interesting, you might not believe it to be radical, but an interesting kind of anti-colonial thrust to his arguments. And so this distinction, I think, might help clarify what makes Matthews' liberalism anti-colonial, despite the kind of broader entanglement and despite the kind of more Fanonian conception of liberalism at the of liberalism's kind of disharmony with anti-colonialism. But I have so much more to say. I want to talk about the idea of a kind of strategic deployment, how equality was used in his ideas when he talked about, for example, cooperation with all on terms of equality only. He was using an evaluative liberalism to expose how colonial cooperation was actually just domination. Again, coming back to what I talked about earlier, was this complex ambivalence in the writings of some of these thinkers was perhaps, if I'm going to be committed to an intellectual history approach, is taking seriously that these kinds of contradictions exist in these texts and ideas. And there's this kind of juxtaposition between normative commitment and evaluative critiques. And while people like Matthews remain normatively liberal in their visions for post-colonial South Africa, they were also quite ruthlessly evaluative about how liberalism functioned under colonial conditions. Does this allow them to maintain an intellectual consistency while being potentially radical? Probably people like Thabang would disagree with that, but I still think it's an important argument to be made, because what we find is, especially when we delve into these writings, is that there is definitely this kind of architecture of radical critique also present. And again, radical, I use it in a reserved kind of way. And this is definitely present in Matthew's work. I hope that helps a little bit to clarify what I'm trying to do here.
Yes, no, thank you.
But I take your point, and it's footnoted, by the way, at the term anti-colonial.
All right, no, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Aisha. Okay, so we've got 2 minutes of question and answer. So please, can we? So she has already answered all the questions that we have. All right,
Okay,
no problem.
I have one question.
Oh,
I
sorry.
have one question.
Yes.
I want to understand, it's fine if you don't want to listen, you can go and have lunch, but I want to understand, why is it okay for academia to continually ask people who are seeking ontological legitimacy within a system that oppresses them? So it's almost like it's okay to question a black person who's trying to liberate themselves, but they don't question the colonizers who violate for the system to be like this. So it's like the study of Z.K. Matthews, for me, it sort of removes this thing of understanding. In fact, let me put it this way. It would have been nicer to, for once, study the white people who created the system that distorted the black lives, besides criticizing someone who was put in the corner and trying to legitimize themselves in a system that seemed impossible. It's easy for all of us to sit here today and say Freedom Charter was this and that, but in 1955, that might have been the language that worked, with the hopes that it opens up the channel to have a conversation. And even in this room today, black faces are here. We are the ones talking about something we didn't create. We're trying to fix a problem that we didn't make. We're in a system that is not by us, not for us, but we are still allowed to criticize our own thinkers. That is not fair.
Thank you so much, Sis Fezek. I don't know if perhaps Ntate Dladla has some response to that, or you, Aisha.
So I heard the last bit of the argument, and I didn't hear the first part because the sound quality is very, very poor. But I did agree with what the member of the audience said. I can't see who it is. I assume it's a lady who spoke. She was very articulate. And what I understood from her by saying is that, why do we have to invest so much of time and attention by critiquing thinkers from the Black Archive when we're doing this work, when they might have been acting in good faith or on best intentions at a time in a system which was necessarily and inherently inimical to their ability to even kind of launch any meaningful kind of political response. I mean, it was extremely repressive and oppressive. And I do agree with that. And so when you're reading these things, and you're reading sometimes the kinds of courtesies that people like Z.K. Matthews and others extend towards the oppressor. For example, there was a fascinating, but a very, very well written, with an excoriating critique of smuts that Z.K. writes, right? And I'm thinking that he had huge amount of boldness and audacity to write this letter in relation to smuts intransigence around the joint councils or something. I can't remember which. It's here in my archival file. And I thought to myself, absolutely, in terms of what the member of the audience has just mentioned, that various actors at the time were obviously acting in response to what they believed to be, the right kind of motivations and intuitions. And for us to retrospectively foist on them all of these other motivations and critique them her point is good. Why are we not investing that same amount of time in actually critiquing the colonial order, which is extremely insidious and pernicious, and which resulted in this? But to her, I would say the following: this work needs to be done. One of the big things that came out of the decolonization movement, which people like us at WITS have been fighting for the last, I would say, 10 years since Fees Must Fall, and even before that, was to create a kind of visibility around these archives, to create a kind of consciousness around these thinkings, not just a political consciousness, but a kind of intellectual awareness and consciousness. I mean, when I have to teach some of these things sometimes to my students, I'm so surprised at how little they know about these kinds of important histories and its own valences. So we can't even go there without first producing some of this work, like putting these ideas forward, publishing them, writing them. And there is some important work coming out in this regard, but without being fractured by all of the ideological discussions. And that's where I say sometimes, it's easier to relegate something to a footnote and say that this discussion is evidence. So that would be my response, if I heard the question correctly. And apologies if I haven't. The sound is not very good.
No, that was actually, you kept it very well, because that was what she was asking. Now, I would like to hand over to Ntate Dladla Mkhatla to just give a quick response.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that response. I think most of the things we will handle them by telegram. I think it makes it easier. But, like there's an article by Art Gordon in 1988 titled Apartheid's Anthropologist, the Genealogy of Africana Anthropology, which claims that ZK cited RFA Hornley's South Africa's native policy and the liberal spirit approvingly. So that, actually ZK Matthews was the protege of RFA Hornley. I don't know, how far, like that goes, and whether like we can still call that anti-colonialism. But well, we will handle it via, the telegram.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. Thank you so much, Mkabaten. And thank you so much to you, Aisha, for honoring us and for honoring our invitation. Now we need to go for lunch. Students, please remain behind. And then the delegates, can you please... okay, so students or delegates? All right. So please, in the meantime, remain. All right. Okay, let's give...